So I think saying there, John, I think we're nearly ready to start. So if I formally introduce myself. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sean Keys. I'm the Regional Chair of the ACE, the Northwest Chair, and also the Managing Director of Sutcliffe Civil and Structural Engineers. I'd like to welcome you to this ACE Insight webinar organised by the ACE Northwest on Project Speed and the Northwest. Today, I'm honoured to say we have a special guest in John Cridland, who is the Chairman of Transport for the North and also President for Northern Transport Accelerate. John Cridland will present on Project Speed and the Levelling Up and the Northern Powerhouse. If I could ask you all to ask any questions through the chat box, that would be really useful. There will be an opportunity for questions, so if you put them in the chat box, we'll either answer them through the chat box or alternatively we'll answer them through the discussions. Again, and don't worry if you don't catch the whole of the webinar, because at some stage it will be put on the internet. I'll take the opportunity now to thank John and pass the presentation over to John to continue for the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. I'm delighted to be with you all this afternoon. I've long had good links with ACE, both nationally and in the north of England, and I'm delighted to make a small contribution on levelling up this afternoon. So we know, colleagues, do we not, that levelling up the northwest of England is now a high government priority, and that's very welcome. But it's not a new concept. Actually, it brings new energy to the Northern Powerhouse strategy, which has been addressing levelling up following George Osborne's initiation of it back in 2015. Actually, in my judgment, as in so many areas of professional life, will require a balance of short-term urgent interventions and long-term important interventions. And without Sean in any way being flippant, that sort of reminds me of my boyhood watching television, where you would watch those 1930s science fiction programs on the television, where you'd always got a space rocket that was about to explode unless two test tubes were kept in balance. And one test tube I think of as my short-term urgent priorities, and the other is my long-term urgent. We can always do today's agenda, folks, and never get round to doing the long-term agenda. We can also spend too much time focusing on strategy and not get anything done today. And balancing those tactical and strategic interventions, I think, is the key to balancing up the North economy. I have the privilege, as the chair's already mentioned, to be involved in both the short term as president of the Northern Transport Acceleration Council, because that's very much focusing on interventions which politicians can see and get action on in the next 2 to 3 years. And my role as chairman of Transport for the North, which is clearly trying to do the long-term strategic planning, but with action starting now, that frankly, as so often with infrastructure investments, will take a generation to bear full fruit. So what I was planning to do in the talk was try and cover 4 key points, folks. First of all, just a reminder of something we already know, but it's worth starting with what is the problem we're trying to solve. Why do we need to level up? Exam question. Secondly, if we do need to level up, what do we need to do? What are the interventions that are actually required? Third, what's happening in the short term, where I'll draw on the emerging work from the Northern Transport Acceleration Council that might be of interest to you. And fourth, what needs to happen in the long term, which will bookend my presentation with the Transport for the North agenda. And then I look forward, Sean, to our discussion, where I'm sure there's a real value for ACE members. So point number 1, why do we need to level up at all? Well, I live here in the north of England, like the rest of you, and for the 16 million of us who have the privilege of living in the most beautiful part of the country, the price we pay is that on average, we are £5,000 worse off than if we lived in the Midlands or the South. That's the living standards of northern citizens as against the English average. Now then, the key question is that just inevitable? Is that the price we pay for living in such a beautiful part of the country? In other words, is it a consequence of locality? Is it a consequence of peripherality? It could actually be. There are some problems in life, frankly, you can't solve. You just have to live with. Why do I say that? Because if you look at Italy, which is another country that's got a long spine, actually, you wouldn't really expect southern Italy, Sicily, to be as rich as northern Italy, Milan and Turin. They're the consequences of rural peripherality, I would argue, are really inevitable. So is that the case in the north? Absolutely not. 100 years ago, the north of England was as rich. 100 years ago, the north of England was the industrial powerhouse of the country. It happened before. Why isn't it happening now? The first thing that Transport for the North did in 2016 was an economic review of the North's assets to answer the question, were we destined always to be that little bit worse off? Or was it because the North was underperforming against its real potential? And I wanted to be absolutely clear about that. Bit forensic, to be honest, colleagues, because otherwise your plan won't achieve anything if your plan is addressing the wrong problem. And the really good answer from that economic review was that the North is underperforming its real potential. It could add about 100 billion of gross value added, of which I guess the Northwest, Sean, would be probably 30 to 40% of that. It could add 100 billion of gross value added over the next 30 years, and it could add 850,000 new jobs over a business as usual position. And there is an economic plan now for the Northern Powerhouse to achieve exactly that. It's very easy. Sorry if there are any consultants on the call who take exception to this slur on consultants. It's very easy to get a consultant's report that has those sort of mouth-watering figures, adding billions here and thousands there. What's it actually based on? What's the underpinning logic for that? Well, what we identified was there's 4 things that the North is really, really good at, and 3 other things that make those 4 things really good. But in each case, if we could multiply the amount of value added that the Northwest economy delivers from those 4 things, we would grow the economy faster, create more high value added, better rewarding jobs, and level up the living standards of Northwesterners. So what are the 4 things? Well, 2 of them didn't surprise me at all, and 2 did. The 2 that didn't surprise me was advanced manufacturing. We know the Northwest of England is hugely strong on that. And low carbon energy. We know the Northwest of England is hugely strong on that. The 2 that actually did give me a real learning, we're really strong in the Northwest of England on health, science and innovation. Around those teaching hospitals, those clusters of entrepreneurs who cluster around the expertise in hospitals. That is a 21st century Northwest strength. And then digital. You know, anybody comes up from London, I always urge them when they get off the train at Manchester Piccadilly, just to take a 20-minute walk around the old mill houses that still exist within that range of Piccadilly and look at the plates on the door of those new style SMEs. We don't know any of the names, but they are digital businesses that didn't exist 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And they populate the grid all over the Northwest of England. The 3 enablers, the Northwest strengths in higher education, the Northwest strengths in financial and professional services like your own, Sean, and the Northwest strength in logistics. And if you've got those 4 key sectors and those 3 enablers, that's about 1/3 of GDP in the Northwest of England, then supported by the coffee shops, sandwich bars and the hotels, and all the other factors that then feed off that multiplier and generator. So using money, I've used money as a proxy, but it's as much about quality of life. We're leveling up the quality of life of Northern families by giving them more rewarding careers, and more rewarding entrepreneurial opportunities, as well as higher living standards. So that's the objective. What do we need to do to level up? Well, as you'd expect, this is why we have governments, national, city, regional. There's a whole series of supply side interventions you'd want to tackle that. And it ranges from more innovation, research and development, to more exports. But the two big levers, much bigger in impact than any of the other levers, are education, raising school standards in state secondary schools in the northwest of England. And many of us are involved as school governors. We know that we need to do more, particularly to help working class lads in areas where ambition isn't always matched by delivery. And actually, we're pretty good at primary education in the northwest of England, but we don't achieve as much as we need to in those state secondary schools. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about the second really big lever, which is transport infrastructure. So why do we think that more investment in transport infrastructure will level up? Well, there's four things I'd say briefly, conscious of time. First of all, we need to better connect up our economic assets. That sounds like a statement of the blindingly obvious, but it isn't actually. It's a statement of something that hasn't been the focus in the past. The Department for Transport would admit that they've mainly been focused on passenger corridors rather than economic corridors. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you can have a company, let's take a chemical company in Yorkshire, that's living in a post-Brexit world and looking for new markets. And maybe that company thinks, actually, I've focused for the last 40 years eastwards on the European market. That's very, very important to me. I don't want to lose it and I want to grow it, but I've focused on that. And because of that, I've worked out how to get my product to the port of Immingham. But now I need to get my product to the superport at Liverpool, because the market I see that may grow in the future is the Latin American market, where I consider as an entrepreneur, I'm underrepresented. So I'm going to take an investment appraisal to my board to try to open up our market access into Latin America. Hey presto, I can't move my product across the Pennines to Liverpool because I hit the congestion on the M62 if I go by road, and I can't get a rail freight path at a time I want and with reliability I want because of the Victorian nature of links across the Pennines. So that leads me to my second point about what levelling up through transport infrastructure is. It's about growth corridors. And if you look at the Transport for the North Strategic Transport Plan, it's not about traditional passenger corridors. So example, we have an L-shaped corridor that starts in the northwest of England in the Lake District and finishes in Sheffield. And the Treasury will ask me, why is that an important corridor? And my answer is because of advanced manufacturing in Lancashire and Cumbria, and advanced manufacturing at the Advanced Manufacturing Centre at Sheffield University. And connecting up that labour market so that somebody can do a job in Leyland and get a promotion to Sheffield, and connecting up the value chain of SMEs, supply chain of people that work together. And then for any economists in the room, I'm not an economist, I'm a historian, but I didn't want the economists to feel left out, Sean. The economic theory behind this is called agglomeration. You connect up the major cities of the north of England without building them together. You connect them up by digital, and in my case, transport connectivity. And the Randstad in the Netherlands would be an example of where you get an economic multiplier through excellent connectivity between separate towns and cities. Now, the examples I've used are principally pan-northern or pan-northwestern examples, but it's just as true of local transport. There's exactly the same principles apply. Look what the Manchester tram has done to connect up different parts of Manchester and Greater Manchester. I'd already be in trouble with Mrs. Cridland because Mrs. Cridland comes from Salford. And if you're born in Salford, you don't accept you're in Manchester. And in her days, people didn't cross the Irwell to get a job because it meant going from one city to another. And now you get on the tram at Salford Quays, and 15 minutes later, you're at Manchester Piccadilly, and you can again get a train to take a job in Leeds, and all sorts of possibilities open up. So what's happening in the short term? If that's the exam question, if that's the mission, how do we go about it? Well, we know that infrastructure investment doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, but by taking time, frankly, you can sometimes lose the will to get it done because it takes so long with the planning system, with the approvals process, that you begin to wonder whether the project was going to deliver. So government clearly at Downing Street level is committed to Project Speed, the title of this seminar, and the DFT is part of that with its acceleration unit, and that's what led Grant Shapps to set up the Northern Transport Acceleration Council, of which I'm president. And what we're trying to do there, colleagues, is take a task and finish approach. And like so many disciplines in business life, actually what we've tried to do is get better, shorter, tighter processes involved, better Gantt charting. And the acceleration unit of civil servants has done an excellent job in building a dashboard, mainly of local authority transport priorities across the Northwest. Across the North as a whole, we've got 180 priority projects, and I would guess about a third of those are in the Northwest. A dashboard of what needs to be done when, what blockers are holding up progress, and then DFT with the relevant local authority are working principally with Network Rail and with Highways England to remove those blockers. I've mentioned about 180 projects on the dashboard, which we're regularly reviewing. It's a dynamic document. About 20 of those need big strategic interventions and the remainder are tactical. So what you'll be interested in from a business point of view are what are the main blockers? And what's been identified, Sean, is there are three main blockers. First of all, getting the money. And that's about business cases. And the business cases are often not strong in the North, partly because of the geography and partly because we don't already have the level of wealth that exists in London. So demonstrating land value enhancement is much harder around an infrastructure investment at a station, and partly because there's so much residual work to be done from the past that actually we need a bigger investment than a business case would typically justify. Some of you will know that the government's recently worked on revisiting the Green Book to ensure that the Green Book for investment decisions embraces the full range of economic, transformational, strategic reasons for doing something, rather than just, can we invest in a new station at Warrington because of the number of passengers that will go through it, which is the narrower, important, but not sufficient reason. The second reason are the actual financial barriers, where clearly you've seen a series of announcements from government about point source specific pinch point road and rail schemes, very local, where the government's actually putting some more money behind them because of Project Speed and identifying the blockers. And some of those spending announcements will clearly require the comprehensive spending review in future years. And then there's an issue of local authority capacity. Some of our smaller local authorities simply don't have the capacity to get these things moving and work with the profession, your profession, and private sector partners. And that's where we can all pull together as a pan-Northern partnership to build that capacity and capability. Easy to say, so is anything actually happening any different? Well, one of the most important schemes, road scheme for the northwest of England that we've been looking at would be turning the A66 into a full dual carriageway all the way from the M6 through to the A1M, a vital east-west link to provide some resilience to the M2. Through the Northern Transport Acceleration Council and Project Speed, we have found ways of shortening the timescales to getting that work done, taking out bits of grit to achieving that. And another example, the other side of the Pennines, would be shortening the timescales involved in Teesside on the very new important Tees crossing, which is a key block. So I think Northern Transport Acceleration Council is speeding things up. But coming back to my science fiction film test tubes, what about the long-term plan? Well, you've heard me talk about this before, so I won't take as long on this. We've got a strategic transport plan, which I think provides a 30-year Bible for government decision-making over 6 parliaments, over 6 road planning phases, over 6 infrastructure rail control periods. And it focuses on growth corridors. Is there anything in that plan which is different from what would have been if Transport for the North hadn't been set up and if we weren't doing these things in the north of England? Well, focusing on time and just keeping to a couple of strategic points, I think the biggest single difference between a northern plan written by northerners for northerners rather than a London plan written for the north by London is that it focuses on east-west links rather than focusing on north-south links. Of course, they're both equally important, but from the Romans through to the Victorians and the post-war motorway network, we've done more on roads and rail leading to London, for obvious reasons, than we've done on those east-west, coast-to-coast, cross-Pennine links. And that also takes us into North Wales, which is clearly very, very important for the northwest of England. There are many projects in that strategic transport plan, but let me mention one which I believe to be the Arrowhead project, which is Northern Powerhouse Rail, a coast-to-coast railway, some of it upgrades, some of it new line between Hull, Newcastle and Liverpool, delivering new freight paths across the Pennines and enabling 10 million northerners, when it's built, to get to any 4 northern cities in an hour by rail, when only 2 million can do that today. That is genuinely transformational, focused on the very important role that Manchester Airport plays as the North's hub airport for all of the North, not just the Northwest, and focusing on the need for fast and reliable step-on, step-off rail links between Liverpool and Manchester and Leeds. I mentioned freight paths. Freight paths also play clearly a critical role in decarbonisation, which has to be the bedrock of any transport infrastructure plan. You invest in rail, you're creating a lot of carbon impact, even if you're getting carbon benefit. You invest in road, as we move towards a zero carbon plan by the late 2040s, you really have to justify now why road investment is the right thing to do and how it can be done in a zero carbon manner. But if we had an hourly freight path across the Pennines from Manchester to Leeds for rail freight, I'm only asking for an hourly freight path, we take 10,000 heavy goods vehicles off the M62 a week. That's worth doing in terms of quality of life and in terms of carbon impact. And in terms of roads, I've mentioned NPR as a rail scheme, providing an alternative, resilience alternative to the M62, given the pressures on that motorway and given the fact of the weather on that motorway in winter, is a large part of why not only are we widening the A66, we're looking at what can be done to take the roads from the M65 in Colne further eastwards across to Harrogate and the A1M, and we're looking at what can be done to improve a really poor road in Manchester and Sheffield, poor because it's crossing one of our key assets, the National Park of the Peak District, and whether there's a case for any tunnelling under some of the most beautiful parts of that route. Now, clearly, our long-term plan, which the North has pretty much produced, the Northern Powerhouse Rail, we're awaiting the outcome of government decision on the integrated rail plan. How will that coast-to-coast railway link with the Y shape of High Speed 2 on a north-south axis so that we get a real diaspora of people moving around the north of England? And that is still awaiting government. Exciting times, I would say, colleagues. I think real signs of progress on the short-term plan, and we're getting to the point where the long-term plan is coming into focus. So I hope, Sean, that was of interest to your members in the Northwest. I'll pause there to make sure we've plenty of time for discussion.
John, that was fabulous. You really enjoyed the enthusiasm. So thank you for that presentation on behalf of myself and obviously all of the members of the AC that are here today. I've got a few questions on the side, and I've got lots and lots of questions to ask you myself after that, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I'll start up with one of my huge frustrations, is that the links between the north and the south are acceptable but could improve. But the one that really frustrates me is the link from Liverpool to Manchester, which is when we were at the forefront of industry and Stephenson built the rocket, we were right at the #1 world leaders. That timescale hasn't significantly improved, and it always brings a smile to my face as an engineer. I'm just wondering whether maybe the new technologies or the digital technologies will be the ones that sort of link that bridge. What do you think?
So we spend a lot of time thinking about whether what we're proposing to build is really 21st century proof. You know, when you've got people like Elon Musk promoting Hyperloops, and you think actually he could get people from Liverpool to Leeds in 9 minutes. So am I right to build a traditional engineered railway that I'm proud of because I can get it down to 40 minutes? Yep. Actually, we've persuaded ourselves that Hyperloop probably is more appropriate for Texas than it is for the Pennines, because actually what we need is some trains that stop rather than just shoot people long distances, because people actually need to be able to get to those jobs. The key judgment we've made, Sean, on the length of time it would take to get from Liverpool to Manchester is you could really shorten it if you simply had a direct route. But I think northern leaders, both civic and business, have felt that the right thing to do is have a connection with Manchester Airport. So some people will want to go straight from Liverpool Lime Street to Manchester stations, but some of them will want to connect via Manchester Airport. And that might add 2 or 3 minutes to the length of that journey, but we're getting that journey down to something of the order of 26 minutes. And the other really important link is what we do for Warrington, because Warrington has for too long been a poor relation. And so a link for Liverpool, Warrington, Manchester Airport, Manchester, with the fastest low carbon rail we can deliver is what we're about.
Oh, there's an interesting question that's come through which ties this together. And obviously we're all engineers on this call today, the majority of us are, and we see the true value of it. I mean, the link from east to west is important, but I think as Darryl suggested, the link to North Wales and Scotland, the Midland, are as equally as important. And how do we ensure that that has the same priority as it seems all roads lead to Rome, or in this case, all roads lead to London? How do we ensure that all the links from North Wales, Scotland, and the Midlands remain strong?
So, from the beginning of Transport for the North, we have had good and effective working arrangements with the Welsh and Scottish governments. I mean, I actually live in Berwick, so I could go and have a walk for lunchtime and walk into Scotland. I'm that close to the border. So clearly, devolution is important, but devolution mustn't lead to a fragmentation, and it hasn't. With Transport Scotland and with the Welsh government, we've very good MOUs, and the vice chair of TfN, Louise Gittings, the leader of obviously Cheshire and Chester, has a focus particularly on those very important links with the North Wales economy, as your colleague mentioned. But I don't think that's sufficient. I think that's tactical. It's what I can do as an operator. What we need is a real commitment from government to make those links work. And my good friend and TfN board member, Sir Peter Hendy, chairman of Network Rail, as you probably know, colleagues, is leading for Boris Johnson a connectivity review. Now, that's somewhat focused on should there be a bridge or a tunnel between Scotland and Northern Ireland, which is an interesting question. But actually what Peter Hendy's looking at are all the links that should exist between the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, and making sure there is a strategic plan which the 4 governments sign up to, which is adequately resourced. And I absolutely agree. Excellent links between Cheshire, and Liverpool and Manchester and North Wales, hugely important. You only got to look at that labour market and look at that entrepreneurial market. It's one market, not two.
No, it's an opportunity. I suppose a financial question around that is, how do we ensure public transport encourages people to use it and change the behaviour? And I'll probably link that in also with pricking people's environmental conscience, to make them think actually driving the car from Liverpool to Leeds or from London to Manchester. How do we encourage people and still ensure it remains an economically viable option?
So clearly, the case for rail investment is very much about mode shift. It's very much about a public transport first focus. Of course, there are people in the north of England, northwest of England, who have no public transport alternative, and it's unlikely they will, and they have to use them. But there are many of us who need that incentive in the way that you've described. I think the key, Peter Hendy would say, the key is that if you go to Liverpool Lime Street Station and you go to Manchester Piccadilly Station, that it's like going to a London tube station. If you happen to have just missed a train, you have a pretty good idea that there'll be one within 10 minutes. And when that one comes, it will be on time. And when it is on time, it will have a seat that you can sit on. Now, that hasn't always been the case of late. Of course, there's a bigger issue than building the infrastructure, and that's public confidence in those networks of public transport. And that was hit in 2018 by the rail timetable debacle, and then by quite a lot of strike action. So we had a particularly torrid year. It's hit every time that engineering maintenance overruns. And of course, to make things better, like a better link between Manchester and Leeds, in the short term, you're making things worse because of the number of blockages you have to do for big infrastructure investment. And then, of course, we've got the COVID situation. COVID has hit confidence in use of public transport. And we're going to need a really big campaign to rebuild that confidence. Yeah. But clearly, I'm sure we'd all agree on this call, Sean, whatever the economic needs, health has to come first. So the moment at which we encourage people back onto transport has to be, as people like Andy Burnham have said, has to be the moment when it's safe for people to travel. Yes,
no, I think that's a very valid point. So one thing we were chatting before the webinar started was about the digital links, and I'm just wondering whether we think that the strength of the digital age, whether that will reduce transport on road transport and encourage transport on the trains, and what impact do you think that digital age will have? I mean, dare I say, everybody who's on this webinar today is watching it over the internet, and going back 30 years ago, this would have been either in central Manchester or Leeds, or it would have been in an office location. How do you think the digital transformation will impact us?
So that's the $64,000 question. Will we revert to commuting into cities on a daily basis? Do we need that capacity for people to be able to do it? Or do we no longer need that extra investment because people will only go in 3 days a week? We know we'll need more flexible season tickets because people won't be doing everyday journeys. Just where will the pendulum settle? My view is that we will not go back to traditional working patterns. Clearly, innovation needs people coming together. Training needs people coming together. But I think people will not go back to what they were doing before. I always remember being invited in early days of chairing TFN, by a small business club of entrepreneurs in Northallerton to go and talk to them about transport for the North. They didn't actually want to talk about transport at all, Sean. They wanted to talk about digital, because they were all entrepreneurs, but they could all do more business if they had better superfast broadband in North Yorkshire than what they'd got. That was their priority. I don't have direct responsibility for that, but I'm fully cognizant of just how important it is. In terms of, does digital completely replace the need to travel? I think the answer is no. I think digital allows entrepreneurs to find new customers. It enables small businesses to interact more openly, to procure more effectively, to tender more effectively, with large companies. But then once they've created a relationship, that relationship will need a physical element. So I think it replaces some travel and it creates the need for new travel. But I think the new travel becomes, one, more flexible, and secondly, more value added. And both of those must be good things.
Oh, absolutely. One thing I'd like to say is that if we can get more cars off the road and make things greener, then the environmental saving to everybody will be just enormous. Just a general sort of one that probably being a bit of an old stick in the mud is that if things get difficult, do you think our industry, the construction industry, engineers will resist the change and try to revert back to some of their old methods of either development, procurement or construction, or do you think this will be just a new age?
So there's a huge issue about the capacity of the construction industry to deliver the levels of investment that I hope in the integrated rail plan government will permit us to have in the north of England. If you think of the Crossrail project in central London, you then think of the HS2 project up to Birmingham. We're talking of projects of those scales, as well as the pinch point short-term investments that I started my speech talking about through the Northern Transport Acceleration Council. And that will involve new ways of working. Clearly, the construction industry is busy focusing on zero carbon and what that means. I mean, the whole debate about whether we should have a coal mine in Cumbria is about whether we're going to make steel the traditional way or whether we're going to need to find ways of making steel the new way. I mean, we have a construction industry which is eminently adaptable. It has to adapt to very changing circumstances all the time. It has to do that with relatively tight profit margins for most small construction companies. So it's learnt to be agile and nimble. So I'm relatively optimistic that it will rise to that challenge.
Now, to be honest, so am I. I think there'll be some elements that will want to revert back to their old ways, but I do think, like all big world problems, people are looking for difference and different changes. One thing that seems to have been used quite a lot in the various documents on Project Speed is the sort of the banner "Build Back Better." What do you think that means to the general public? What do you think their perception of what building back better will mean?
So there's a levelling up agenda, which is clearly that the North has been somewhat left out or a little bit overshadowed. And some of what we've talked today about east-west links in balance with north-south links reflects that. Why has it taken us so long to have a world-class train service between Liverpool and Manchester and Leeds? But I think I would argue very strongly that Build Back Better is build back for the 21st century, not for the 20th century. And there, I think the absolute priority is the decarbonisation agenda. So if you take my particular responsibilities for transport, yes, there is a lot of focus on decarbonisation, mode shift, as you've already said, Sean, to public transport's part of that. Electric vehicles is part of that, electric passenger cars, the role of regulation in ultimately banning petrol cars. But actually, we need a lot more thought about decarbonising HGVs. You know, wherever you go on the motorway network in the northwest of England, we are full of HGVs. We know why, but decarbonising HGVs is a major part of Build Back. So there are paradigm shifts. It's back to the coal mine question. There are things we might have done 5 years ago that if we want to build back better, we have to build back smarter.
No, I couldn't agree more with you. One of the questions that's on the chat page is, what are your views on the skills gap in order to deliver infrastructure projects, specifically rail, and how do we ensure our future engineers are well equipped in order to deliver programs such as NPR?
So I think this is a hugely important issue. It's not one that I'm very conscious of its importance. It's not one I have direct responsibility for. But the pipeline issue, I think, has bedeviled construction, hasn't it? You don't need me to say that construction has faced this feast and famine, good years followed by lean years. I think that's particularly debilitating for people in the industry. You know, people who one moment can't working enough hours of overtime, and the next year lose their job because the industry is shrinking. And then we're surprised when some of those people don't want to come back into the industry, because 2 or 3 of those experiences, they've had enough. And that's, if you like, at the craft and technical level, the brickies and the electricians, hugely important people. When you get to the absolute top level skills that you require for boring tunnels, then it's absolutely vital that there is a pipeline. It's vital for a well-organized industry. It's vital for investment, but my word, I'm sure your question has this in mind, it's vital for skills. And therefore, the 30-year plan, so saying to government, we know each parliament will take its decisions on the priorities. We know each government will decide how much money it's got to spend. But if industry can see that in 30 years' time, we will have these excellent links between Liverpool and Hull, and each 5 years we'll do another bit of that, we'll bite off another bit, then actually you've got something that international investors will want to invest in. You've got something that FE colleges can set up long-term programs to train people in 21st century skills, because there is a pipeline. That may sound a bit overly hopeful, but to me, it's not rocket science, it's just what we need to do.
Now, interesting actually, John, we're involved in one of the colleges and they're actually talking to industry, asking what do we need? And I think one of the things that we constantly talk about, we do need, anybody who comes out today has to have digital skills, so it's a real essential skill for anybody coming out. Another general question was, what do we see as the biggest challenges to unlock the North?
So I think the biggest challenge is decisions in the North need serious investment for the long term. We can't get over the problems of decades of underinvestment without the North being given the resources it needs to achieve this. Government stepping up to the plate. We'll hear more in the integrated rail plan. But, you know, my Northern Powerhouse rail, Hull to Liverpool with a spur down from Newcastle, most on the eastern side of the country is upgrade, most from Leeds westwards is new line, including into Liverpool. That is going to cost of the order of 30 to 40 billion. That sounds a massive sum, but we're talking over a 20-year period. But think what Crossrail cost and think what HS2 is costing. And we need that investment because at the moment, the line that goes from Manchester to Leeds via Huddersfield is moving at speeds that it was moving at 50 years ago. So we've got the chance now to write our own plan, but clearly we don't have fiscal devolution, and it requires ministers of the Crown to be able to persuade the Treasury and get the authority of Parliament, and all those people still sit in London. I'm optimistic we can get there, but it's going to need sustained investment over a generation.
You know, I agree with that. One thing I believe is that anybody in the Northwest or the North, we want London to succeed, but then equally we want the North to be as wealthy as the North as London is, and effectively the whole wealth of the whole country will rise. Just in terms of project speed, this is another one of my questions. How do we see it making the UK a more equal place? So there's been a lot in the press about making the whole country more equal on different levels. How can we see this would be one of the, if you like, one of the triggers to make it change?
So I think it's about building on the distinctiveness of different parts of the country rather than trying to spread the jam evenly. Yeah. That's why I started with my comments about what's the North really good at, and my advanced manufacturing, low carbon energy, health sciences, innovation, and digital. Build on the things we're really good at. We've had plenty of experiments of trying to take things out of London and bring them to the North. We're talking about it now with the Treasury moving to Darlington and some of the DFT to Leeds. There's a role for that. I'm not saying there isn't a role for that, but I don't think it's as powerful a mechanism as concentrating on the distinctiveness of the North. You know, our key assets, our ports, the North's ports are world class. The North's ports on both coasts are a national asset, just as London is the country's financial centre. We don't need to compete with London on what it's good at, and they can't compete with the North on what we're good at.
No, I couldn't agree more with you. So it's interesting. I was chatting to an engineer friend, and he was quite pleased. But the vaccine for COVID was actually made 20 miles from where he lived in the Northwest. So we have got some special skills that we sometimes need to remember. Now, let me just see if I've had a few more questions coming through while we've been chatting. Question we both got, skills gap. We dealt with the skills gap question. No slides. I think there was one on, I think it was just a general comment about the North and the digital. What do we think that the North is as strong as the South in digital, or do you think it's more universally spread, that effect on terms of project speeds? Do you think that the North is as strong as other regions, or slightly stronger or similar?
So I would say it's slightly stronger. I was really struck by how the digital small businesses that I've already described in the 20-minute walk from Manchester Piccadilly Station, you'd find that, Sean, in most towns and cities in the north of England. This is something that we don't talk about enough. It is a real strength. And it's back to London looking at life one way. And actually, if we look at things through a northern lens, we look at it differently. A few years ago, the digital debate was all about Silicon Fen, London to Cambridge, and then it was about the Old Street roundabout in London, for those who know London well. So it was always about building digital clusters in London that you could drive to from Downing Street if you wanted a photo call. Clearly, those are very important, but people weren't talking about digital in Manchester and digital in Sunderland. But actually, it's all over the North. And I do believe we punch above our weight on that. But it's mainly businesses that none of us have heard of.
No, absolutely. What I found is some of these creatives, they move into an area that's really run down, and then they transform the area and make it a product, a viable area, and then you get squeezed out and they have to move somewhere else. Well, I feel sorry for anybody that's forced to, but it's actually, it helps to generate wealth. So I do actually believe with you that we are strong, and we're also strong in life sciences. We need to focus on what we're good at. I've got no other questions there for you, John. Have you got anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that covers it. I deliberately didn't use PowerPoint today, colleagues, because I thought we should have an interactive discussion. But all the things I've talked about, certainly from the TFN point of view, you'll find on the TFN website. So if you want to know more about the growth corridors, you want to know more about the Northern Powerhouse rail plans and the route, it's all on the TFN website. Northern Transport Acceleration Council is clearly newer, Sean. It hasn't published very much, but I come back to those series of government announcements that you're getting about individual schemes in the Lake District or the A66 or the Wirral, and those sorts of things that are being announced are coming out of the dashboard and removing the grit.
Just before we move on, I've had one question coming very last, which is another interesting one. It says many parts of Cumbria will start to convey electricity via overhead lines and power and common occurrences. In order to meet the levelling up agenda, there is also a need to ensure power is available in these areas. What's your views on that?
Well, absolutely. I focused on transport because that's the area I'm responsible for, but energy infrastructure, hugely important. It's important to entrepreneurs. You can't build entrepreneurial opportunities if you're not sure the energy is going to be there. And I've tried to stress 2 or 3 times, whilst you and I will always, and colleagues on the call will be focused on the entrepreneurial opportunities, this is also about quality of life. The reason the North is so great a place to live in is because of places like the Lake District. So we have to make decisions on whether things should be pylons over the top or tunnels underneath, and those are equally legitimate. This is about social economy as well as economics.
I couldn't agree more with you. So you think about how lucky we are, really, what we have on our doorsteps. They're coming in again, so I'll keep it going. We've got a couple more minutes. What consideration is being given to assisting the local authority procurement teams to speed local projects through planning?
So I'm afraid I don't have a detailed answer to that at my fingertips, but I hinted at it with this question of local authority capability. So clearly local authorities have been under a lot of pressure on resources, and they do need help to be smarter clients. The smarter they can be as clients, the better your members can be in helping them deliver public objectives. That's recognised.
Absolutely. One thing I'm involved in the Liverpool City region, and they've set up a built environment board. So again, they're talking to industry, real people who are involved in it. So I think they're out there listening. So I think we're probably all the engineers who are out there and other people on this webinar, if they're interested, there are people out there who want to hear our views. Again, I think we'll agree on this question that's just popped through. Do you think that government COVID offices should be relocated outside of London to tip the balance of the influence outside of London?
Well, I think there is clearly a role for more London civil servants and government officials being based in the north. And to be fair to government, they have a clear agenda to seek to do that. And I think we've seen with some of the COVID interventions that local interventions are likely to be particularly successful. My point is, I don't think that will be a panacea. As long as in tandem with that, you build on the things that the North should simply be shouting about more because we're really good at them, then the two strategies together work really well.
Again, coming through again, so they're keeping us going here. The government announced the latest round of restoring railway funds this week, with 85 projects submitted proposals. Oh, excuse me, I've got a little message just pop on the screen. Does the government need to do more with these types of initiatives? And do we need to consider increasing funding for small incremental projects which have a community buy-in?
So yes, yes, and yes, I think to that. I think the government was right. Talk about reopening railway lines. Clearly, you're looking for interventions which can get things done quickly. You've already a rail bed, even if it hasn't been used since the beaching cuts. You're looking at small interventions that don't require the Treasury to sign off on big spending decisions. I think actually the government is a victim of its own success. They've got the North excited on these reopenings, and there's now huge opportunity. Up in my part of the world, in the Northeast, there's a real momentum now behind reopening the Leamside line. And if we reopen the Leamside line, that provides huge resilience alongside the East Coast Main Line. And I'm sure there are examples similarly in the Northwest. So I think that question is yes, yes, and yes. Empower local people to do things which will be popular locally.
Absolutely. I do think, again, most of these questions, engineers tend to agree. I think we've answered all of the questions. So I think probably at that point, I'll just start to draw a close to things. Everybody on the webinar, I'd like to personally thank you on behalf of myself and John and the Association for Consulting and Engineering for attending. And a particular special thank you to John Cridland. That was fabulously interesting. I could carry on talking to you all afternoon. We should go to the pub afterwards when we're allowed to. And I said I could carry on talking about Project Speed. I will just remind everybody that the ACA has produced four separate documents, which are really interesting reads. They've got some good, solid background on what's happening in the NHS, the rail safety, which John's given us a fantastic talk about, and obviously building school programme and housing, which is very close to my heart. So at that point, I'd just like to thank John, and I'll pass over to John if John wants to have any final words.
Just to say, it's been a pleasure to contribute. It's never quite as easy as when we're physically in the room and we can meet and talk, but I hope it's been helpful to people, and I look forward to continuing to work with ACE.
Thank you very much again, John. Thanks for everybody for attending. I look forward to speaking to you all very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye now.